The North Atlantic had become a graveyard waiting to happen, and nobody on the surface knew where the graves would open. Beneath the dark waves, in the crushing depths where sunlight died and sound became the only truth, Soviet submarines glided like steel leviathans through waters that Western navies had once called their own. These weren't the crude, clattering diesel boats of the previous war. These were nuclear-powered hunters, carrying enough firepower to erase coastal cities from existence. And they moved through the ocean with a silence that turned every merchant convoy, every carrier group, every naval formation into potential victims. The captains of these vessels understood their power, and in the shadowy doctrine rooms of the Kremlin, admirals smiled knowing their invisible fleet held the throat of the Atlantic hostage. NATO's surface ships prowled above, their sonar pinging desperately into the void, listening for echoes that rarely came, while below them the threat circled, patient and unseen. This was the nightmare that kept Western admirals awake through the long watches of the 1950s, the cold mathematics of a naval war they were losing before it even began. The ocean had become a chessboard where every enemy piece was invisible, every move a potential checkmate, and the hunters of the surface had become the hunted. Every Soviet submarine that slipped past Iceland and Greenland represented not just a tactical failure, but an existential threat to everything Western naval doctrine had built across 2 centuries of maritime dominance. These boats carried torpedoes that could shatter a cruiser's hull like glass, and many carried missiles tipped with warheads that made conventional weapons seem like children's toys by comparison. Intelligence reports painted an increasingly grim picture. More submarines launching every year, newer designs running quieter and deeper, patrol areas expanding farther into waters once considered safely under Western control. The submarine captains grew bolder with each successful patrol, testing defenses, mapping response times, learning the rhythms and weaknesses of their opponents. And the most terrifying truth, whispered in classified briefings and contingency planning sessions, was that Western forces had almost no reliable way to find these predators until it was far too late. The silent threat had arrived, and the balance of power beneath the waves had shifted toward those who embraced the darkness. The radar operators sat in their cramped compartments aboard destroyers and cruisers, staring at green screens that showed them only the surface of the ocean, a 2-dimensional picture of a 3-dimensional battlefield where the real war unfolded in a realm their equipment couldn't touch. Their sonar systems, descendants of technology, rushed into service during the last global conflict, pinged uselessly into thermal layers and ocean currents that bent sound waves like funhouse mirrors, creating phantom contacts and dead zones where entire submarine flotillas could hide in plain acoustic sight. The detection ranges were pathetic, sometimes less than a few thousand yards in bad conditions, meaning a destroyer might find a Soviet submarine only when both vessels were close enough to see each other's destruction as inevitable. Training exercises revealed the humiliating truth again and again. Submarine commanders playing the role of Soviet captains would penetrate defensive screens, reach simulated firing positions on high-value targets, and escape undetected while surface ships flailed blindly in their wakes. In classified after-action reports, the word that appeared most frequently wasn't improvement or progress, but vulnerable, typed in capital letters and underlined by hands that trembled slightly while writing it. The technological gap wasn't narrowing. With each passing year of the 1950s, it widened like a crack in a dam that would eventually break catastrophically. Western naval power, built on the assumption of surface dominance and clear sightlines to the enemy, had been rendered nearly obsolete by an opponent they couldn't see, couldn't track, and couldn't kill before it killed them. The aircraft carriers, those floating cities of steel that projected American power across every ocean, had become particularly vulnerable targets, their massive size and unmistakable radar signatures making them impossible to hide, and almost suicidal to operate in waters where Soviet submarines prowled with increasing confidence. A single nuclear-powered attack submarine, costing a fraction of what a carrier battle group represented in ships and aircraft and trained personnel, could theoretically sink the entire formation if it reached firing position undetected. Pilots returning from patrol flights reported nothing useful, their radar and visual searches meaningless against threats that lived beneath the surface, while the destroyer escorts, spread out in protective rings, knew their sonar couldn't provide adequate warning time against modern torpedoes that traveled faster than the ships they targeted. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Detection ranges, measured in hundreds of yards, against weapons, with ranges measured in miles. Reaction times measured in minutes, against attacks that took seconds to reach their targets. NATO strategists ran simulation after simulation, each one ending with carrier groups at the bottom of the Atlantic, their aircraft and crews entombed in steel coffins that would rest in darkness until the ocean itself died. The desperation manifested in rushed programs and experimental systems that rarely worked as advertised, prototype detection equipment that promised miracles and delivered marginal improvements at best, while procurement officers signed contracts for weapons designed to fight yesterday's war because nothing better existed, and standing still meant certain defeat. Admirals delivered increasingly grim assessments to political leaders who demanded solutions that technology and tactics couldn't yet provide. The gap between what was needed and what was possible growing wider, with each intelligence report confirming another Soviet submarine launched, another patrol area expanded, another technological advancement that made their boats quieter and deeper diving. The hunter-killer groups formed specifically to track and destroy submarines found themselves hunting ghosts, chasing acoustic shadows and magnetic anomalies that disappeared before weapons could be deployed. Their crews, exhausted by the endless cat-and-mouse game they were losing. In the officers' wardrooms of Western warships, the conversations grew quieter and more fatalistic. The professional confidence that had defined naval service for generations eroding under the weight of a threat they couldn't counter with existing capabilities. The ocean had become an enemy itself, its vast depths and acoustic complexity providing perfect sanctuary for adversaries who had mastered its secrets, while Western forces remained bound to the surface, their visibility ending just meters below their keels, where the real war waited in patient predatory silence. Something had to change, and it had to change quickly, before the next crisis turned theoretical vulnerability into actual catastrophe, and the Atlantic became what Soviet planners intended, a Soviet lake where Western ships ventured at their mortal peril and never with confidence of return. The emergency meeting convened in a Pentagon conference room where cigarette smoke hung thick as morning fog over the Potomac, where admirals and engineers and procurement officials gathered around tables covered with technical drawings and budget projections that represented the Navy's last desperate gamble against an enemy that owned the depths. The requirements seemed almost contradictory, a carrier-based aircraft small enough to operate from existing flight decks but large enough to carry detection equipment that weighed tons, fast enough to cover vast patrol sectors but slow enough to methodically prosecute contacts, simple enough to maintain at sea but sophisticated enough to find submarines that had defeated every previous system designed to hunt them. The program received a designation that revealed nothing about its purpose, just another alphanumeric code in the Pentagon's endless bureaucratic taxonomy. But everyone in that smoke-filled room understood they were designing the weapon that would either save Western naval power or represent its final, futile gasp before obsolescence became irreversible. Lockheed's engineers proposed something radical, a twin-engine jet with high-mounted wings that could loiter for hours over suspected submarine operating areas, packed with sensors that would turn ocean transparency from Soviet advantage into Western weapon, crewed by 4 specialists whose entire existence would revolve around finding and killing threats that lived in permanent darkness. The prototype took shape in California facilities where security clearances were checked 3 times daily and covered windows prevented even satellite observation of the work proceeding inside, where computer systems primitive by later standards, but revolutionary for their era, processed acoustic data faster than human. Operators could interpret it, where weapons bays were designed to carry torpedoes and depth charges that could reach submarines at depths previously considered safe sanctuary. Test pilots flew early models over the Pacific, their aircraft loaded with concrete ballast, simulating sensor equipment still being debugged in laboratories, reporting. Handling characteristics that ranged from adequate to concerning, but never good enough, to abort a program that had become too critical to cancel regardless of technical shortcomings. The name came later, Viking, invoking ancient seafarers who had mastered northern waters through skill and determination, hunters who had turned hostile oceans into highways of conquest. It seemed appropriate for an aircraft designed to reclaim the Atlantic from adversaries who thought they had inherited dominion over its depths, to transform Western vulnerability into Soviet nightmare through technology and tactics that would make hiding impossible and survival uncertain. The first operational Vikings rolled off production lines bearing the grey paint scheme that would become their signature, a color that rendered them nearly invisible against overcast skies and storm-darkened seas, camouflage for hunters who needed to approach their prey without warning. Carrier crews watched these ungainly jets arrive aboard their ships with mixed feelings, appreciation for capabilities desperately needed, but skepticism about unproven systems and concern about deck space consumed by aircraft that couldn't drop bombs or shoot down enemy planes, that served a single purpose in a mission profile most sailors never witnessed and couldn't fully understand. The Vikings' crews underwent training that transformed them into specialists of a peculiar kind, technicians who fought battles measured in acoustic signatures and magnetic variations rather than guns and missiles, whose victories would be recorded in classified logs rather than gun camera footage, whose importance to Western survival vastly exceeded the recognition they would ever receive. Squadron commanders briefed their new pilots and sensor operators with unusual gravity, explaining that every flight meant potential contact with an adversary who had owned these waters for too long, that the balance of power beneath the waves was about to shift in ways Soviet planners hadn't anticipated and couldn't adequately counter. The sensor suite they packed into the Vikings' fuselage represented technological ambition bordering on desperation, equipment that individually would have filled entire rooms crammed into spaces measured in cubic feet, connected by wiring harnesses that weighed hundreds of pounds, and required maintenance procedures complex enough to demand specialized training schools. The magnetic anomaly detector extended from the tail like a stinger, sensitive enough to register variations in Earth's magnetic field caused by thousands of tons of steel passing through water hundreds of feet below. Technology borrowed from geologists searching for mineral deposits, now weaponized to find submarines. That thought depth provided invisibility. Forward-looking infrared sensors scanned the ocean surface for thermal signatures that betrayed a submarine's passage, the slight temperature differential where disturbed water rose from below, evidence invisible to human eyes, but blazing like signal fires to detectors cooled to temperatures approaching absolute zero. Radar systems powerful enough to map surface contacts across horizons also detected periscopes and snorkels raised for seconds during battery charging runs, those brief moments of vulnerability when diesel boats still needed to breathe. The acoustic system represented the Vikings' true revolution, sonobuoys dropped in patterns that created underwater listening networks spanning square miles, each buoy transmitting sounds detected in the depths back to processors aboard the aircraft, where operators wearing headsets listened to the ocean's voice with intensity that aged them visibly. These weren't simple hydrophones, but sophisticated arrays that could differentiate between biological sounds and mechanical noise, between friendly submarines and Soviet contacts, between harmless merchant traffic and the distinctive acoustic signature of a Victor-class attack boat attempting to shadow an American carrier. The sensor operators worked in near darkness, broken only by screen glow, their entire world reduced to cascading. Waterfall displays showing frequency patterns and bearing lines, cryptic visualizations that revealed to trained eyes what remained hidden to everyone else. They developed instincts that bordered on supernatural, the ability to sense contact before instruments confirmed it, to predict submarine behavior based on fragmentary data and hard-won experience accumulated through thousands of hours hunting adversaries who grew smarter and quieter with each encounter. The integration of these systems created something greater than the sum of components, a detection network that turned ocean opacity into transparency, that made hiding progressively more difficult and escape increasingly uncertain for submarine captains who had operated with near impunity just years earlier. Vikings would arrive on station and begin dropping sonobuoy patterns according to tactical doctrines, refined through war games and actual patrols, creating acoustic fences across choke points and probable patrol areas where Soviet boats were expected to transit. The aircraft would then enter patrol patterns designed to maximize sensor coverage while conserving fuel, flying racetrack circuits over cold northern waters where waves reached heights that could swallow destroyers, and weather conditions ranged from merely hostile to absolutely murderous. Inside the cramped cockpit and sensor station, crews worked with concentration that permitted no distraction, knowing that a moment's inattention might mean a missed contact, that the submarine they failed to detect today might sink a carrier tomorrow. The weapons bay carried torpedoes, specifically designed for air launch, sleek cylinders of explosive and guidance systems that would enter the water at calculated points and dive toward contacts identified by the sensor suite, plus depth charges for attacks requiring saturation rather than precision. These weapons represented the final link in the detection-to-kill chain, the Vikings' ability not just to find submarines, but to prosecute them to destruction, to transform acoustic contact into tactical geometry that left targets with no escape options and no time for evasion. Crews practiced attack runs until procedures became automatic, until the sequence from sonobuoy contact to weapon release required no conscious thought, until every member knew their role in choreography that might someday mean the difference between Western naval supremacy and catastrophic vulnerability beneath the waves. The first Viking squadrons arrived on carrier decks like grey prophets of a new era, their twin-engine silhouettes appearing through Atlantic mist as flight crews watched with the skepticism reserved for untested aircraft, carrying survival on their wings. The jets touched down on pitching decks, where spray froze before hitting steel, where carrier operations continued regardless of weather that grounded land-based aircraft, where every landing represented a calculated collision between controlled flight and organized chaos. Maintenance crews swarmed the Vikings immediately, connecting fuel lines and opening access panels to systems still radiating heat from flight, beginning inspection routines that never truly ended because these aircraft carried technology too precious and mission too critical to permit mechanical failure. Within hours of arrival, the Vikings began flying, their presence transforming carrier battle groups from forces that could project power into formations that could also defend themselves against the threat prowling beneath their keels in darkness and silence. The patrol patterns they established over the Gyeogyok Gap turned empty ocean into surveilled territory, creating invisible fences across choke points where Soviet submarines attempting Atlantic access faced detection probabilities. that climbed from possible to probable to nearly certain. Vikings launched in weather that turned flight decks into skating rinks, catapult officers giving signals while bracing against winds that could lift grown men off their feet, pilots advancing throttles knowing the next 30 seconds would either end in flight or disaster with no middle ground. Once airborne, they disappeared into grey overcast that merged sea and sky into uniform bleakness, navigating by instruments toward stations identified only by coordinates where they would spend hours hunting adversaries that might not even be present. The ocean below held secrets measured in megatons, Soviet missile boats carrying enough destructive power to erase cities, attack submarines stalking American carriers with torpedo rooms loaded and fire control solutions calculated, all of them moving through depths where detection had once been nearly impossible. Inside the Vikings' cabin, crews settled into rhythms that would define their service, sensor operators watching displays that transformed ocean acoustics into visual patterns, navigators plotting positions that placed aircraft over optimal detection zones, pilots maintaining altitude and heading with precision that kept sensors effective and fuel consumption manageable. The sonobuoys fell at intervals determined by tactical doctrine and operational experience, each one sending back sounds from the depths where metal objects disturbed natural acoustic environments in ways that processors could isolate and identify. These were missions without glory and often without contact, hours of monotony punctuated by moments of electric intensity when a buoy detected something anomalous, when bearing lines converged in ways that suggested not random noise but purposeful movement, when the hunter suddenly realized the prey might actually be present beneath hundreds of feet of cold Atlantic water waiting for its own opportunity to strike. The psychological impact rippled through both fleets, like pressure waves through deep water, American carrier groups operating with confidence that came from knowing Vikings circled overhead, Soviet submarine captains realizing the ocean had become transparent in ways that fundamentally altered risk calculations and mission viability. Every Viking patrol represented hours of potential contact. Every sonobuoy pattern created detection opportunities that accumulated into certainty. Every flight reinforced the message that the sharks had indeed become minnows, hunted by aircraft they could neither see nor escape, tracked by sensors they could neither deceive nor destroy, facing a technological revolution that had turned their greatest advantage into their most dangerous vulnerability, beneath waves that no longer offered sanctuary, but only temporary concealment before the grey ghosts found them again. The mission began before dawn, when the carrier turned into wind, and the catapult officers' illuminated wands traced patterns against darkness that still held stars over a restless Atlantic. The Vikings sat on the catapult, with engines spooling to full power, airframe trembling against the holdback fitting, while 3 crew members inside checked instruments and confirmed systems one final time before the violence of launch. The tactical coordinator in back had already marked their patrol station on charts, showing ocean empty of features, except depth contours, and the invisible line where Soviet submarines traditionally crossed from safe water into hunting grounds. When the catapult fired, acceleration slammed them from stillness to flying speed in 2 seconds that compressed spines and blurred vision, the Viking clawing into grey pre-dawn sky while the carrier fell away beneath them into darkness and spray. They climbed through cloud, layers that turned the canopy into streaming opacity, breaking into clear air above the weather where first light painted the tops golden while the world below remained lost in shadow. The navigator called out their heading toward patrol coordinates 100 miles northeast, where intelligence suggested a Soviet boat might be transiting southward toward convoy routes, and the tactical coordinator began preparing sonobuoy patterns that would either confirm the threat or rule out the sector for another 6 hours. They arrived on station as dawn broke properly, the sun revealing endless grey swells marching toward horizons that curved away into atmospheric haze, thick with moisture. The pilot established their pattern at 800 feet, low enough for magnetic anomaly detection, but high enough to cover territory efficiently, the Viking banking into a racetrack oval that would define their world for the next 4 hours. The first sonobuoys fell at intervals carefully calculated, each one hitting water with small splashes. Invisible from altitude, then descending on parachutes to listening depth where hydrophones began transmitting everything the ocean revealed. For 90 minutes, they heard nothing but biologics and distant merchant traffic. The tactical coordinator marking negative contacts with notations that might mean safety or might mean the submarine was simply deeper or quieter or positioned where their pattern missed detection. Then buoy 7 registered something anomalous, a sound that didn't match whale song or shipping, a mechanical rhythm that suggested machinery turning somewhere in the depths below their patrol area. The tactical coordinator's voice came through the intercom with controlled urgency that every crew member recognized as contact imminent, calling for tighter pattern and additional buoys to triangulate the source. They dropped 4 more in quick succession, the pilot banking harder now as patrol became pursuit. Everyone inside the Viking feeling tension rise because something was definitely down there moving. Through water that suddenly felt less empty than inhabited by steel and men playing the same deadly game from opposite sides. The bearing lines on the tactical display began converging with geometric precision that confirmed not random noise but a submarine maintaining course and speed, probably unaware that aircraft circled overhead with sensors, penetrating the concealment that had once guaranteed survival. The tactical coordinator calculated intercept points and attack geometry while the pilot positioned for simulated weapon release. The entire crew locked into choreography they had practiced countless times, but which now carried weight because the target was real and the Cold War was not abstract doctrine, but actual tonnage of Soviet metal moving beneath them with torpedoes ready and mission orders that made this ocean a battlefield without gunfire. They tracked the contact for 2 hours as it moved southwest, dropping additional buoys to maintain acoustic lock, the tactical coordinator feeding data to the carrier while the pilot maintained position overhead like a bird of prey, circling something that couldn't see sky. The submarine never surfaced and never deviated, its captain either confident in his stealth or ignorant of the Vikings' presence, continuing patrol while above him, American eyes watched and calculated and reminded Moscow that the ocean's protective darkness had become transparent, that the sharks were indeed minnows now, hunted by technology they couldn't match, an aircraft they couldn't escape beneath waves that no longer offered sanctuary but only temporary concealment before the hunters found them again and again, until the Cold War's mathematics made their missions pointless exercises in being tracked by adversaries who owned the depths as completely as the surface. The Vikings' technological revolution began not with a single system, but with integration, the way dozens of sensors and processors worked as unified organism, converting ocean noise into tactical intelligence that previous generation hunters could never achieve. Inside, the cramped fuselage behind the cockpit, 2 operators sat surrounded by displays showing acoustic signatures as cascading waterfalls of color, each frequency band revealing different characteristics of submarine machinery that couldn't be silenced, no matter how many rubberized tiles Soviet engineers mounted on hulls. The acoustic processor could distinguish reactor coolant pumps from propeller cavitation, could identify specific submarine classes by the unique sound profiles their machinery produced, turning the ocean's chaotic symphony into readable language that told hunters exactly what swam beneath them and how deep and how fast it moved through water that no longer protected anything. The magnetic anomaly detector mounted in the tail boom sensed distortions in Earth's magnetic field caused by steel hulls displacing normal patterns, providing confirmation when acoustic contacts seemed ambiguous or when submarines ran silent, hoping to avoid detection through noise discipline alone. The forward-looking infrared could spot periscopes breaking surface or detect thermal signatures from exhaust if boats needed to snorkel, adding visual dimension to the electronic hunt that made concealment nearly impossible across multiple sensor spectrums. Everything fed into a central tactical system where the coordinator synthesized data streams into a single coherent picture, deciding sonobuoy deployment patterns and weapon release points with computer assistance that eliminated guesswork from equations that once depended on luck and intuition against adversaries who controlled when and where they revealed themselves. The weapons themselves reflected this same lethality through precision, torpedoes guided by acoustic, homing that could pursue targets through evasive maneuvers, depth charges fused to detonate at specific depths calculated from tracking data rather than estimated positions. The Viking carried enough ordnance to prosecute multiple contacts during single patrol, enough sonobuoys to cover areas measured in hundreds of square miles, enough fuel to remain on station for hours, while submarines below burned battery power trying to escape detection that followed them like persistent shadow. Every system redundant, every sensor cross-checking others, the entire aircraft designed around the philosophy that finding Soviet boats mattered more than speed or range or any other capability that dominated fighter design. This technological overmatch fundamentally altered Cold War naval calculus because it made submarine operations catastrophically expensive in terms of boats lost or compromised, in terms of missions aborted when detection seemed likely, in terms of psychological burden on crews who understood they swam through water that American aircraft had transformed from sanctuary into killing ground where every depth offered only temporary refuge before the hunters found them again. The reports began filtering back to Moscow through encrypted channels that carried weight far beyond their technical language, each patrol debriefing revealing patterns Soviet Naval Command found, increasingly impossible to ignore or dismiss as statistical anomaly. Submarine captains who had operated with near impunity through previous deployments now returned describing oceanic environments transformed into hostile territory, where American patrol aircraft appeared with alarming regularity over areas once considered secure transit routes. The acoustic contacts came too frequently, the sonobuoy patterns too precise, the pursuit coordination too relentless for anything except fundamental shift in detection capability that rendered previous operational doctrine dangerously obsolete. Northern Fleet admirals gathered in Severomorsk, staring at maps where safe passages seemed to vanish, where choke points became gauntlets, where the Atlantic hunting grounds their ballistic missile submarines needed to reach had transformed into defensive nightmares requiring complete tactical recalibration. Soviet response came through multiple channels, each adaptation carrying costs that multiplied across naval budgets already straining under demands of matching American carrier groups and maintaining strategic parity. New quieting technologies meant heavier sound-dampening tiles covering hulls, meant redesigned propulsion systems sacrificing speed for silence, meant reactor modifications that reduced output to minimize pump noise that acoustic processors could identify across impossible distances. Training protocols changed to emphasize deeper operating depths where pressure and thermal layers might confuse sonobuoy networks, longer periods running on battery power that limited operational radius and patrol endurance. More conservative approach patterns that acknowledged American aircraft had fundamentally altered risk. Calculations for every mission into contested waters. The psychological burden spread through submarine service like contagion no political officer could contain, crews understanding they operated against adversary who could find them in darkness that no longer protected anything, who tracked them through waters that had become transparent to sensors they couldn't evade or deceive. The doctrine revisions reached fleet level within years. Soviet naval strategy forced to account for American anti-submarine capabilities that made offensive submarine operations exponentially more dangerous than Cold War planners had anticipated. Attack boats that once prowled aggressively now moved cautiously. Ballistic missile submarines altered patrol areas to avoid known Viking operational zones. Entire deployment schedules restructured around avoiding detection rather than accomplishing offensive objectives. The cost measured not just in rubles spent on quieting technology, but in strategic capabilities surrendered, in missions scrubbed. When detection seemed likely, in submarines recalled rather than risked against hunters, who seemed everywhere at once across ocean spaces too vast for such comprehensive coverage, yet somehow achieved it through technological superiority Soviet engineers couldn't match or counter. By the final Cold War decade, the mathematics had shifted irreversibly against Soviet submarine force that found itself hunted rather than hunting, forced into defensive posture by unglamorous grey jets that transformed naval warfare without firing shots that would have meant civilizations ending in nuclear exchange. Both sides ultimately refused to trigger. The strategic calculus shifted beneath. Admirals and defense ministers like tectonic plates grinding toward inevitable conclusion. Every naval assessment revealing balance of power tilting inexorably toward Western dominance through technological advantage. Soviet economy couldn't match, no matter how many rubles flowed into submarine programs already consuming resources desperately needed elsewhere. Pentagon analysts compiled reports showing Soviet patrol frequencies declining, submarine deployments shortened, operational areas contracting toward defensive bastions near home waters, where protection seemed possible against American hunter-killer groups ranging across ocean spaces, with confidence that spoke volumes about shifted maritime supremacy. The Atlantic passages Soviet ballistic missile submarines needed for strategic deterrence patrols had become gauntlets where detection seemed inevitable, where every transit risked exposure that compromised boats costing fortunes, measured in economic output, diverted from civilian needs already creating political pressures no Politburo committee could indefinitely ignore or suppress through propaganda, declaring victories that operational reality contradicted. NATO naval exercises through the 1980s demonstrated capabilities that Soviet observers documented with growing alarm. American carrier groups operating with impunity through waters once contested, Vikings launching from flight decks to establish sonobuoy barriers that channeled Soviet submarines into predictable patterns or forced them into defensive postures, abandoning offensive objectives entirely. The demonstrations carried messages requiring no diplomatic translation, every patrol flight announcing technological supremacy that rendered Soviet naval investment increasingly futile. Every detection, reminding submarine captains their expensive boats had become liabilities rather than assets in strategic competition, draining Moscow's treasury toward breaking point. The psychological warfare proved as devastating as any depth charge attack. Soviet naval prestige crumbling under accumulated evidence, their underwater forces faced adversaries they couldn't defeat through courage or tactics when fundamental technology gaps made concealment impossible and aggression suicidal. The maritime dominance achieved through unglamorous submarine hunters contributed directly to broader strategic exhaustion that would ultimately collapse Soviet system unable to match American technological advancement across multiple domains simultaneously. Defense budgets strained attempting to counter carrier aviation while developing quieter submarines, while maintaining ballistic missile deterrence, while matching Star Wars initiatives that collectively demanded resources exceeding any planned economy's capacity to generate without triggering civilian unrest over declining living standards. The Vikings' contribution measured not in dramatic combat victories, but in relentless pressure applied year after year, Patrol after patrol, detection after detection that made Soviet naval ambitions untenable and helped bankrupt maritime programs, consuming fortunes to achieve obsolescence. Victory came silently, like the submarines it hunted, unmarked by triumph parades, yet fundamental to Cold War conclusion that saw Soviet Union surrender strategic competition it could no longer afford to wage against adversaries whose grey jets had transformed ocean warfare into losing proposition no amount of courage or ideology could overcome when mathematics demanded capabilities beyond economic reach. The grey twin-engine jet rolled across the carrier deck one final time in late 2009, its angular fuselage bearing scars from decades patrolling ocean spaces that had witnessed history's greatest naval standoff. Without most civilians ever knowing, the battles fought in silence beneath wave-crested surfaces. Maintenance crews who'd spent careers servicing Vikings watched the retirement ceremony with emotions military bearing couldn't entirely conceal. Knowing this unglamorous aircraft had accomplished strategic victories, fighter jocks would never understand because glory came from preventing wars rather than winning them through spectacular combat footage designed for recruitment videos. The S-3's contribution measured in missions flown without incident, in Soviet submarines detected and tracked until their captains understood concealment had become impossible, in strategic calculations, altered by technological advantage that made underwater aggression futile, and helped bankrupt maritime ambitions through relentless operational pressure applied year after year. The final Viking, trapped aboard for the last time, carried history in its sensor bays and sonobuoy dispensers, equipment that had transformed apex predators into hunted prey and shifted Cold War balance toward conclusion few had anticipated when Soviet submarine threat seemed insurmountable during those desperate early years. Aviation museums accepted retired Vikings with little fanfare compared to fighter aircraft drawing crowds with dramatic profiles and combat histories told through gun camera footage and kill markings painted beneath cockpit rails. The submarine hunters deserved monuments equal to strategic bombers because their contribution to Western victory proved equally fundamental. Yet democracy's nature meant unglamorous achievements faded from public memory, while spectacular weapons systems captured imagination through characteristics having nothing to do with actual strategic importance. Veterans who'd flown patrol missions through decades of Cold War tension understood the paradox, knew their aircraft had helped win history's most dangerous confrontation without firing weapons in anger, had made Soviet naval operations untenable through technological superiority that rendered courage and ideology insufficient against mathematics of detection capability. The Vikings' legacy lived in negative space, in submarine attacks that never happened because detection made them suicidal, in strategic calculations altered by patrol aircraft most citizens couldn't identify despite their fundamental contribution to maritime dominance. The retirement marked Cold War's final chapter closing. As veterans aged and classified missions remained secret despite their historical significance to generations who'd never comprehend how close civilization had teetered toward nuclear exchange over ocean spaces where grey jets had hunted invisible threats. Young sailors walking carrier decks, new Vikings only as outdated aircraft occupying hangar space needed for newer systems, designed for different threats, emerging from different adversaries in changed strategic landscape. The institutional memory faded like sonobuoy signals dying in dark waters. Operational knowledge accumulated through decades of anti-submarine warfare dispersing as crews transferred to other platforms, and Viking mission profiles became historical footnotes rather than active tactical doctrine. The submarine hunters departed service, carrying secrets about patrol patterns and detection capabilities and Soviet submarine characteristics learned through patient surveillance that had built comprehensive understanding of adversary capabilities used to achieve dominance without spectacular combat victories. The Forgotten Sentinel's greatest achievement remained its obscurity, having prevented catastrophes that never materialized because deterrence worked through demonstrated capability, making aggression futile rather than through destructive proof. Delivered in wartime desperation, the Vikings had turned sharks into minnows without drama befitting such strategic transformation, their grey forms disappearing into aviation history alongside reconnaissance platforms and cargo haulers whose unglamorous missions proved essential to outcomes determined by logistics and intelligence rather than firepower alone. The ocean spaces they'd patrolled for 35 years continued hosting naval operations in new century facing different threats. But the Cold War maritime battlefield, where Vikings had hunted Soviet submarines into obsolescence, existed now only in classified reports and fading memories of crews who'd fought Shadow War most. Citizens never knew had raged beneath waves, hiding history's greatest naval confrontation. What forgotten Cold War technology completely changed warfare without anyone noticing? Subscribe to discover the weapons that won wars in silence.